Okay, Nicholas Meyer is here with us, and as we discussed before, he's made a big splash in the Star Trek series with what most consider the best of that series, The Wrath of Khan in 1982, followed by his writing work on Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, and his writing and directing work on Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. He's a brilliant director, movies like Time After Time, just terrific stuff, and a writer. He's made an incredible mark as well with Summersby and Collateral Damage, The Human Stain, Elegy, which we discussed with him. That's a beautiful, beautiful film. And also a novelist. I mean, writing The 7% Solution.
That's right.
Really before he got into film and then adapting it for the screen. He's a tremendous talent. His new book is called The View from the Bridge, that talks all about his life in Hollywood, separated by, pre, during, and post-Star Trek years. And it's a great read, and it's available on paperback as well now. You can purchase it on our website there. Just click on that icon. It'll take you to Amazon where you can buy it. Highly recommend it. Highly recommend it. Here's Nicholas Meyer talking to us about his terrific career. Early on in the book, you mentioned that if you were to write another book, you could title it Everything I Know I Learned from Movies. So I was wondering from you, what did movies teach you about the world when you were growing up and about yourself?
Well, there are two books which are really interesting from that point of view. One is called Past Imperfect, History According to the Movies, and the other one is called A Hollywood History of the World. And both these books start out with a somewhat lighthearted premise that when Hollywood gets involved with history, they usually get it wrong. But in fact, you can learn an awful lot of history from the movies, and movies get a lot of things right. Some of the, sometimes they get big things wrong and details right, and sometimes they get details right and big things wrong. But there are a lot, as long as movies were in search of stories, there was no shortage of historical events, large and small, for which they could draw. Just the other night I was showing a friend of mine a French film called Monsieur N. Did either of you gentlemen see Monsieur N? Came out in 2003?
I've heard of it, haven't seen it.
It's a terrific film, and it's about Napoleon in exile on St. Helena. And ultimately, it's a tall tale. It's a romantic extrapolation based on whether he did or did not escape from St. Helena as he escaped from Elba. But the movie gets everything right about what St. Helena was like, because I've since read all these books about it. I don't know if that's where they actually filmed it, but it sure looks like it. And Napoleon even speaks French with an Italian accent, which would be historically correct since he grew up on Corsica, which became French, I think, the day before he was born, but is otherwise Italian-speaking, and so forth. And suddenly I'm watching this thing, and movies are showing me Napoleon on St. Helena, and I'm learning about all the people with whom he interacted, his doctor, his jailer, the little girl who was in love with him, and so on. And that was like a typical example for me. And, you can watch the 10 Commandments of Cecil B. DeMille, of whom it was said, Cecil B. DeMille, much against his will, was persuaded to keep Moses out of the Wars of the Roses. But having, granted him his ton of salt, there was a lot that was very accurate about his depiction of Egypt at the time of Ramses. So yeah, you can learn a lot from movies. You can watch All the King's Men, the original Broderick Crawford movie about Huey Long, and learn about that. So yeah,
it definitely gave you an insight into the outside world.
Made me want to read about it too.
Yeah. But you've been doing this you've had such a long and distinguished career. Are the reasons why you make movies now and write for film, are they the same as when you started?
Yes, which puts me at a disadvantage, because as movies become rides instead of stories, there is less and less interest in narrative or unearthing sort of obscure things. It's more about, using the technology and seeing if you can blow up the car in 3D, all of which is something of a yawn for me. The last movie that I had that was out was based on a Philip Roth novella. The novella is called The Dying Animal. The movie's called Elegy. And it's just about people trying to, figure out which way is up. And I tend to go to those movies.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about Elegy. But since you brought it up, let me bring up the end of the interview at the start. Elegy is a great movie. It's one of my favorite movies of the past few years.
Oh, thank you so much.
And I was really taken by there's one particular scene with Dennis Hopper and Ben Kingsley when Dennis Hopper is on his deathbed. That one of the most astounding scenes I've seen, I think. Were you on the set frequently for that film? And tell me about your impressions of that film.
Well, it was the second time I had attempted to adapt something of Philip Roth's for the screen. And the first time, I wasn't very happy with the result. My screenplay got sort of changed, which would be bad enough, but my screenplay was scrupulously faithful to Philip Roth's novel, which was called The Human Stain. And I was troubled. I was sad that it wasn't as gratifyingly politically incorrect as Philip Roth to be, as in your face, and they kept sort of trying to smooth it into a romance and sort of make it user friendly, and it didn't quite work for me. Whereas when the same producers had hired me to tackle The Dying Animal, which I thought was kind of not a good Saturday night title. Honey, you want to go to see this?
Right.
Dying. I had trouble with the title The Human Stain, which I wanted to call American Skin. But, this time I just didn't ask. I just typed Elegy on the title page, and I thought, okay, if they don't use it, they don't use it. But Isabelle Cochette, who directed the film, just hewed really, really closely to what had been originally written. She trimmed it, which I think it probably needed to be trimmed. Most screenplays do. I think the attrition rate for dialogue in a script of mine between the first draft and the answer print is probably 50%. 50% of the words are going to go. But somehow the full sort of impact of them still remains, the way people who've lost limbs sometimes say they can still sense the feeling in the missing limb. So I think there's some vague parallel there. And as far as that scene goes, I think, like everything else, it was more or less filmed as written.
Oh, it's one of the great Dennis Hopper performances, I think.
He was terrific. He was wonderful. He was a wonderful actor.
Yeah, very much. Now back to your book and your beginnings. You divide your book into kind of three parts, kind of pre-Star Trek, during Star Trek, and post-Star Trek. Do you really feel that that's what characterizes your career into stages, post and pre-Star Trek?
Well, let me be candid about the book, how it came to be written, and why I structured it this way. The book, which for the benefit of anyone listening is called The View from the Bridge, Memories of Star Trek and a Life in Hollywood, was written by me a year ago. It'll be 2 years ago, January, when I wrote it. And at that time, the Writers Guild went on strike. And that's when I tend to write books. I wrote The 7% Solution, my Sherlock Holmes, Sigmund Freud book, back in the 70s, because I'd no sooner come out here than the Writers Guild went on strike, and you weren't allowed to write scripts. So that's a good chance to write a book, and in this case, I certainly needed to keep deriving income. I have a family to raise. And so my agent said, well, write your memoirs, which I thought, well, I'm a little young for memoirs, but and I knew that the way to get a memoir of mine published would be to center it around Star Trek. That was the most sort of easily commercial hook on which to hang it. And once I'd figured out that that's why the book was going to be published, it was then a sort of no-brainer to organize the rest of it, you know, in terms of what came before Star Trek, and what came after it.
Yeah. Well, you've written books, and obviously you're a prolific screenwriter, but I would think writing your own life is a different animal. What surprised you about the process of doing that?
Well, much less research, for one thing. I believe that all memoirs, all autobiography is probably a sort of species of forgery. It's going to be inevitably self-serving. It is going to be how you remember it. In fact, the first thing in the book I talk about is this whole very subjective quality of memory and how easily one is tempted to, skew events from your own perspective. Having said that, I did, go on IMDb a couple of times to remind myself what year certain film came out or what somebody's name was in the crew that I might have forgotten. But otherwise, it was fun to write because I did get to sort of ransack my memory for things that happened not only on various movies, but various sort of stages of my life before I was making movies or before I was making Star Trek movies. And I found also that a memory would pluck out another memory, that one thing would sort of lead to another. And pretty soon you'd have this daisy chain of recollection. And then it became important to sort of leave a lot of it out. At the end of the day, it's a professional, almost more than a personal memoir. I tried to put enough personal stuff in to sort of hang it all on. But really, it's a book about movies and loving movies and fun times that happen when you got to make movies.
Right. And going through the pre-Star Trek period, I mean, you'd really made a splash with your book, The 7% Solution, and the film that came out after, and time after time. But you were never a Star Trek fan. I think the little bit of exposure that you had to the series you thought was a bit cheesy. So when you were approached to do the movie, tell me what approach you took. And do you think that the fact that you weren't a follower of Star Trek, that gave that film, that made that film the success that it was? You were thinking outside the box in a way.
Well, I have said elsewhere that movies are like soufflés. They either rise or they don't, and you can't predict that a soufflé will rise by simply following a recipe, because each movie is a slightly different animal. That's a very mixed metaphor, and I'm sorry about the animal. I got involved with Star Trek because I was introduced to the man entrusted with producing the second Star Trek film, a lovely man named Harv Bennett. And it was because of my being very sort of taken with him and thinking what fun it would be to sort of hang around him and work with him was a big inducement. The other inducement was that they started to show me Star Trek episodes and the previous film and so forth, and a lot of it, as I had wrote in the book, it was hard for me to sort of relate to a lot of it because I couldn't understand certain things. I didn't understand why they all wore pajamas. This was bizarre to me, or how they folk or so forth. But in the back of my mind, it all reminded me of something that for a while I couldn't name, that I liked very much, and it was eventually I realized it was a series of books that I read as a kid by a British author in the 30s named C.S. Forester. He called himself C.S. Forester. And this was a series of books about Captain Horatio Hornblower, who was an English naval officer during the Napoleonic Wars. And he had many adventures, and in different ports and with different ships and so on. And I thought to myself, gosh, this really seems like Hornblower in outer space, Kirk as Captain Hornblower. And once I sort of glommed onto this thought, then the next thought was, wow, here's your chance to make a Hornblower movie, a Navy movie. There was a Hornblower movie with Gregory Peck, which I loved as a kid. And I thought, here's your chance to run out the guns. And that became my inspiration and my approach. In fact, there's a moment in The Wrath of Khan where they actually do run out the guns, which everybody yelled at me. So anachronistic. And I said, well, I don't care. I just need to do this. I want to do this. Sort of my favorite shot in the movie. And I was talking with a big fan of the film who said to me, what do you mean anachronism? They had to do that. All the photon torpedoes were out of commission and so on. So he completely rationalized, and it's the great collaboration between the audience and the artist, where that never occurred to him that was an anachronism. He was ready to meet me halfway. Of course they had to do it this way.
Perfect as it's been.
Later I asked him to marry me,
You have a special way, though, with all the Star Treks you've been involved with, of taking the fantasy element of it and imbuing it with this reality, which makes the fantasy easier to grasp and relate to in a way.
Well, I think that is certainly philosophically where I was coming from. I mean, part of it is a very sort of flat-footed, earthbound sort of take on all this stuff. I'm not a big sci-fi fan, and when, for example, we were doing Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, and this involves among other things, an assassination in space, where the Klingon chancellor is assassinated. And I remember when I was working on the script, and I thought, how do you assassinate somebody in space that's cool? And I was sort of daydreaming, and I thought, why is it that when you see any outer space movies, the people always walk down corridors as though it was a Holiday Inn? How come when I look at movies of the space station, everybody's floating? And I sort of thought about this for a while, and I thought, well, clearly at some point in the future, post-space station, there's going to be some machines on these ships that simulate gravity, some centrifuge or something that lets things not float off in all directions. And then I thought some more, and I said, that being the case, how come when all these ships are blasting away at each other with their ray guns or whatever they are, that these gravity machines are never hit? And what if they were? Wouldn't everybody suddenly just start floating? Wouldn't their ray guns come sliding out of their holsters and so on?
Yeah.
And it was out of this rather sort of flat-footed, earthbound, logical progression of thought that assassination scene in 6, which I think is my favorite sequence in the movie, was born. So I'm always trying to think of the sort of the earthbound aspect of it, the hornblower stuff, and then sort of, take away the gravity next.
I really liked that scene, actually. Visually, I thought it was great. So you did a great job. That was a great idea, I think.
Well, thank you. It was certainly, I was really excited when I was sitting at my desk and coming up with it. And I remember getting a tap on the shoulder from someone who turned out to be me saying, how are you going to do that?
Yeah.
And I remembered saying to that director half of myself, go away. We'll figure it out.
Even the blood floating, visually.
That was the thing I loved, was the floating blood. And how are you going to do that? And I had no idea of knowing how, relatively easy it was going to be because of, the coming of CGI. The Wrath of Khan was, I think, one of the first movies ever to use the Genesis demo.
That's right. Yeah.
But, it couldn't have passed for real. It could only have passed, for being what it was, which was supposed to be a demonstration tape.
Yeah. Star Trek has fans unlike any other series of films, really. They're very, very loyal and committed to the series. Was there in your work in the Star Trek films, were there any considerations of trying to satiate the fan base, or did you just follow your own voice all the way with it?
The latter.
Yeah.
I don't think art is made by committee.
Yeah.
And I can't second guess millions of people, not just the fans, but anybody that when you make a movie, I can't second guess the reactions of 60 million people I've never met. I make the movie that I want to see. I write the book that I would like to read, and I make an assumption. And the assumption is, if I like this, other people would like it. I would never tell you a joke that I didn't think was funny.
Mm-hmm.
On the off chance that you might think it was funny. I'll never get a laugh that way. I can only tell the joke if I'm sort of laughing and get a kick out of it. Art is a sort of a dictatorship. You don't have to read the book. You don't have to go to the movie. But if you do, it's my movie, and I hope you like it, but that's the best I can do. I don't mean this to come out in any way arrogant. It's a sort of process of elimination. And I also believe that people who call themselves fans don't really ultimately know what they want. And how could they? So that when, somebody sends me a note that says, if Spock dies, you die, which I thought was sort of unnecessary. I thought, this isn't about whether you kill Spock. It's about whether you kill him well. If it emerges in the movie as some piece of crass manipulation, some clause in an actor's contract being worked out or something, which, by the way, I never knew it to be. But if it comes out that way, then people will be right to be incensed. But if it has its own organic logic, if it makes dramatic sense, then no one's going to object. And you know what? No one did. It's like, people have said, well, you can't make Sherlock Holmes a drug addict, a cocaine addict. And I said, well, in the first place, I didn't make him a cocaine addict. Arthur Conan Doyle made him a cocaine addict. I'm just merely writing about the addiction. But also, you don't understand something about the difference between a hero and a god. Heroes have imperfections. That's what makes them heroes. If a man jumps into a raging torrent to save a drowning child, he's a hero. But if the same man jumps into the same torrent to save the same kid, and he does it with a ball and chain attached to his leg, is he more heroic or less? I would argue more. And that Holmes's addiction, which, some people were so incensed by, you've diminished our hero. I said, no, I haven't. I've expanded his heroism. I've acknowledged that he manages to function despite this crippling disease.
Yeah. Well, going from heroes to villains, actually, one of the great villains in film from the past 30, 40 years, I think, is Ricardo Montalban in Wrath of Khan. And you write very lovingly about working with him and starting a friendship with him in your book.
He was a lovely, lovely man. Very smart, very sensitive, a lovely collaborator. He was the only actor I hadn't really done more than have lunch with before he showed up. And of course, I have to tell anybody who's listening that yes, that's his real chest. It always seems to come up somewhere in these conversations. But I didn't really know him, and I didn't really know what it would be like to work with him. We hadn't rehearsed or anything. But I found that he was really sort of thrilled to collaborate on something. He said, I can't be objective. I don't know what I'm doing up there. I need someone at the steering wheel. And that was, in fact, a very warm, and I'd always say, the smaller it is, the better it is. Laurence Olivier said that an actor should never show an audience his top, because once they've seen your top, they know you got no place else to go. So, and I said, and also crazy people, they don't have to yell, because they're just they're scary. The quieter they get, because you never know when they're going to suddenly. And I sprang up out of my chair at him, and he sort of moved back, and so yeah, it was a lovely collaboration, and it became a lovely friendship.
And another great discovery from that film, actually one of yours, was James Horner, who composed.
James Horner and Kirstie Alley.
Absolutely. That's right. Yeah, James. What did you recognize in James Horner that you knew he could bring to Star Trek II?
Well, I should preface it by saying that Star Trek II was made for a fraction, 1/4 the amount of money that the previous movie had been made for, which meant that there was no way we could buy ourselves a gold-plated genius like Gary Goldsmith. We simply couldn't afford him. So I listened to endless demo tapes, and I found it very difficult to hear an original voice. And that's what I'm looking for when somebody scores a movie of mine. I want their music to be the voice of the movie. If you ever watch, Carol Reed, The Third Man, and you listen to that zither, there's no way when you hear that play that you're going to think of anything except that movie. Right. And that's sort of what I was looking for. And I was also looking for somebody with a genuine melodic gift. I find that a lot of film scoring has become so sort of generic that they all look like sort of late model cars, which at a certain point all began to resemble each other. Remember when cars really looked different? And so I was looking for somebody who was going to, have an individual voice and be capable of sort of giving this movie a voice. And I definitely wanted the music for the film to. It was sort of, I kept listening to La Mer. I kept listening to over and over again La Mer. And when I finally sat down with young Master Horner, I said, Debussy, and he said, yeah, absolutely. And I said, well, listen to La Mer and give me, something that's nautical and swashbuckling and so forth. And that's what he did. He played me some of these tunes, and I'd play them in my head while I was directing.
It's a great score. Well, Rick and I both are obsessed with film scores, and
I have a big collection.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Rick, did you have any more questions about Star Trek before we?
Well, if you're talking about Star Trek and music, you should get a hold. Do you have Robert Farnham's score? For Captain Horatio Hornblower?
No, I don't.
Oh, well, you should get it and then listen to the opening fanfare and find out what big fans Gene Roddenberry was of Captain Hornblower.
All right.
Wow. I wanted to ask you, Rick, did you have anything about Star Trek that you wanted to bring up, or?
No.
Okay. I want to ask you real quick before we let you go about a couple of other projects. For me, one of the astounding credits in your resume is The Day After, and I know that's a project that's very dear to your heart. And reading about what it took to get it off the ground and produce it and get it to the screen, I'm curious, if you were to remake that today, what about it would be different given the climate of today?
Well, it's very interesting. In a way, I don't know that you can remake it. There's no point in remaking it without updating it. Would you subscribe to that idea?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. So the world in which we live is not a world where thousands of nuclear-tipped warheads in bunkers between the United States and the Soviet Union, unblinking eyeball to eyeball. That's not what's going on anymore. The bomb that you have to worry about, that I have to worry about, that everybody has to worry about, is going to be carried by somebody in a suitcase.
Yeah.
And you won't know about this suitcase until the suitcase explodes and takes the city of, Los Angeles with it. So any version of The Day After would be a film that took place, that started with the explosion of such a suitcase, I presume, and then would be about the city or the locale where the bomb goes off. But it doesn't quite, one of the interesting things is that when the Soviet Union collapsed, when the philosopher, that conservative philosopher at Harvard, Francis Fukuyama, suggested that we had reached the end of history, a phrase which is echoed and discussed in Star Trek VI, because that's also about the collapse of the Klingon Empire, which was our, look-alike for the USSR. The movie has a slightly smug ending, which has dated in a rather curious way, which is to say, Kirk says some people can be very frightened of change, and basically denouncing the conspirators who assassinated the Klingon chancellor as a sort of retrograde attempt to maintain the status quo between, the U.S. and the Soviet Union is what they were really. But, and that people who tried to do this were somehow just scaredy cats. Whereas now, 20 years later or whatever it is, I can sort of imagine people saying, "Oh yeah, I long for the good old days when armies were armies and not guys with suitcases, and governments had some control, or at least the illusion of some control over these weapons." It's a Star Trek VI assumes that the world is about to get to a better place, and I'm not sure that if one was doing The Day After today, you would be starting from a better place.
That's true. And but it was such a brave television. The Day After was. I mean, I can imagine HBO running with a topic like that today. But this was kind of revolutionary for television back then.
Well, it was so revolutionary that when they told me about it and showed me the script, I said, "Well, you're not going to. How can you put this on network television? Where there wasn't really much cable. But you're going to put this on network television? They watch Charlie's Angels. People are going to, just fall to pieces if you even think you're going to get this on the air."
Something like 100 million people.
100 million people watched it, yeah. Which I watched it, but I watched it because it was my film, and I'd never seen anything of mine on TV. So I'm sitting there looking at it, and I'm thinking, is anybody else going to sit still for this? So I was very surprised the next day to learn that 100 million people had watched it.
Do you think there's something why we watch movies? Do you think it's partly to face those kinds of unknowns and those kinds of fears? Do you think that's what appealed to people with The Day After? Why so many tuned in?
Well, I think a lot of people tuned into the day after because they were told not to. I think, William Buckley and Phyllis Schlafly put us over the top because they ran up and down the country like Chicken Little saying the sky was falling if this movie was aired. And then people started saying, well, yes, you should watch it, with church groups. You should watch it holding hands. You should watch it with your family and so forth. And then it became this big sort of curiously unifying event, which is funny because if you think about it, it was the most watched movie ever made for television, and it will remain the most watched movie because there's simply too many channels now.
Right.
And between all the different ways we can stream entertainment or download or whatever, you're never going to have, and it's all something that I think I miss. It used to be that when I Love Lucy was on, everybody watched I Love Lucy. And the next day, everybody talked about what they had seen at the water cooler or wherever it was. And we were more sort of unified, more cohesive as a country because we shared these network experiences. And now that everything is fragmented and everybody is literally listening to his own station, we don't have that community, that commonality anymore. And I miss it. I especially miss it, the great thing about going to the movies or going to the opera or going to a play, where you go to a theater, you go to a place where you sit with a bunch of people, you don't know them, they don't know you, and you have an experience that is simultaneously intensely personal, but at the same time, it's a group experience. And television's way of doing that to the degree that you could say it did that, was when we all watched the same thing on the same night, the last episode of MASH or whatever it was, and collectively, socioculturally, psychologically, shared that experience at the same time. And I miss the fact that we don't do things at the same time.
It's not there anymore. Before I let you go, I've been reading about this project for years. And I want to know where it stands now. It's a screenplay that you wrote, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt. Where is that now? The last I heard, Scorsese was mulling it over.
Well, it was originally written, Scorsese was the director, and Leonardo DiCaprio was going to do it. And at the moment, there's talk of revamping it as a miniseries because there was so much more in the book that didn't get put in because making it. So, I would say if I live long enough, I get to see my movies made, and I just got to ask everybody to hang in there, and one day we'll see Theodore Roosevelt.
I hope so.
Fingers crossed.
Also,
the Crook Factory with Johnny Depp.
The Crook Factory. That's another screenplay.
Yeah.
Okay. And what else do you have coming up?
Oh gosh. Well, I'm in the middle of working on a film about Frank Lloyd Wright at the moment.
Oh wow. Architect.
The architect, yes, but particularly about the murders in Wisconsin, where the guy who worked for him went crazy and slaughtered 7 people up at his place while he was away. And about, what are the rights and privileges of genius? Do you get to ignore the rules that the rest of us have to go by? Or, are there different rules for people like that?
Yeah.
He thought, there were. And, maybe he learned there weren't. Well, it's called Taliesin, and as I say, live long, prosper, and maybe the movie will come out.